Welcome back to Samwise. I'm Samwise, and today I would like to talk about the Night Angel Trilogy by Brent Weeks. Brent Weeks is an interesting author when talking about the history of the modern fantasy genre. He became popular in the early 2000s with this trilogy, around the same time that books like The Name of the Wind, the Mistborn trilogy were really popular, and his books were listed as similar among those. And if you hear a lot of people talk about how they got into reading fantasy, besides the classics, many people will list Night Angel as one of their formative series. In recent years, though, the discourse around the Night Angel trilogy has somewhat soured by a lot of people who either read it way back in the day or have read it recently and believe that it hasn't held up. And Brent Weeks as an author has interested me in a while, and so I've been reading through the Night Angel trilogy this last year. I actually started the first book last year, back in 2023, and DNF'd it about 20% of the way through. I put it down. And then this last year, when the new recordings with Simon Vance were released, I've been slowly listening through those, and just recently finished off his first trilogy. And what struck me was there's some very interesting philosophical points made and questions raised that I think are being overlooked in the bigger discourse about the series, for whatever that may be. When you hear people discuss the Night Angel trilogy, you'll mainly hear it in the context of a couple things. Either one, talking about Brent Weeks as an author, which many people tend to have there's some very public people who speak negatively of him. They've had bad experiences with his books and just have kind of soured on both Lightbringer, which I haven't read, and his Night Angel books. I understand that. One of the other major points is talking about how his prose in the Night Angel trilogy are kind of weak. That was kind of what made me put it down in the first place last year. And then the third point that you'll often hear people discuss is his problematic portrayal of a lot of women characters, and sexuality. There's some things that could potentially be seen as sexist in the way that he writes women, and all of these different criticisms are legitimate. I understand that, but I think that if we only look at that, there's some interesting things that Brent Weeks does in this trilogy that we'll miss. So I'd like to talk about three main philosophical points that are covered in the Night Angel trilogy. The first thing I'll say is that there's a bit of a conflicting narrative as to what part of fantasy Night Angel should be listed under. I've heard many people use the words young adult to describe it, but it is not. While there are many young adult characters in the series, that's the primary viewpoint characters are all under the age of 22, so they're all young adults. The content of the books is among some of the darkest stuff that I've read in grimdark series. Certainly much darker as far as content goes than stuff, say, in Joe Abercrombie's First Law series, or even some things in A Song of Ice and Fire. I was shocked by how dark Brent Weeks was willing to go in his books because the narrative that they are young adult had been put out there, and I'd heard it as much as I did. And so I was really surprised. However, I'm going to make the argument today that the Night Angel trilogy, though it uses many of the trappings and many of the dark elements that are often found in grimdark fantasy novels, I'm going to make the argument that this trilogy is actually anti-grimdark. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along here. But the first philosophical point that I'd like to talk about that Brent Weeks looks at in this trilogy is his exploration of character maturity and also empathy. So in a lot of fantasy books, when you look at ruling class characters, you have characters like Jezal from the First Law, or a bunch of characters that you could name from A Song of Ice and Fire that tend to be very cocky, corrupt, not really moral characters. Or you can see characters like many of the leaders in The Lord of the Rings that are noble, upright, and good. And while there are plenty of examples of ambiguity in between them, Brent Weeks does something very interesting with the primary ruling character in his Night Angel trilogy, and that's the character of Logan Geyer. I'll just say as an aside, there will be mild spoilers in terms of generally talking about characters, alluding to certain arcs, but I'm going to really avoid spoiling any specific plot points or things that should make a first-time reading experience of the series. It shouldn't affect that in any way. So Logan Geyer, when we begin the first book, is he's a boy. Age-wise, he's a young man, but maturity level, he is an absolute boy. He thinks he knows what's wrong with the world. He thinks he knows how to fix it, just like all young men do. And yet, he has an incredible amount of immaturity. And it takes him, over the course of the trilogy, literally going through hell before he comes out to a place where he is fit to be in a position of leadership. Because Logan is in the line of kingship. And so this is seen as something that's very likely in his future, and yet his character does not line up with it. And so we have a sort of a Prince and the Pauper type story here, not in the sense of any type of character swap, but simply that Logan must go to the bottom scum places of the kingdom that he lives in and go even below that to be able to understand the intense suffering that the people that he has authority over, that they go through on a daily basis that he never would have realized. And it is only through walking through that, being able to empathize with those deep on a lower level, that he's able to come out a wiser man by the end of the trilogy. And it's a very fascinating character arc for him, one of the better ones in the trilogy. The other character that I would like to go over is, just under this point of maturity and empathy that Weeks explores, is the character of Azoth, who later gets called Kylar. He's our main character in the whole trilogy. And what's interesting is how Azoth matures, because he begins as an orphan boy, a street rat, and sees his best and only option of getting out of that life to apprentice to a masterclass assassin named Durzoblint. They're called wet boys in the series. I'll just say assassin because I don't know what Brent Weeks was thinking when he decided to name his assassins wet boys, but it's not the most intimidating name, so this assassin, Durzoblint, is who Azoth, this young boy, apprentices for. And at the beginning, he has this very traditional 21st century version of morality as far as when should you kill, when should you not kill, when is it justified, when is it not. And Brent Weeks immediately takes this apart, because you have this image from a lot of even Hollywood movies where you'll have the good guy, defeat the bad guy, but he won't go the final step and actually kill him. And the reason why is to maintain a sense of moral high ground in your hero. But the reality is that in many of those cases, if you let the bad guy go, or even if you keep him alive, you are very likely allowing him to produce greater chaos and evil on the world at a future date. And a version of this happens with Kylar at different times in the series, and he has to mature to a place to realize that there is a proper time to take the life of those who are truly evil. That when you are put in a position of this kind of power, there is a strong moral duty that comes with it. Now the trick is knowing when to exercise that power and knowing when it is within your prerogative. And Brent Weeks doesn't give a clear answer of, well, here's when it's justified to kill and here's when it's not. But it is a very fascinating topic that's explored there, that is actually at times a more moral choice to kill a bad guy, to kill an evil person, than it is to just let them live and go on harming people or even detaining them with the high chance that they could escape or that people from the criminal underworld could assist them in future malevolence. The second question that I'd like to talk about here in terms of philosophical things that I think Weeks explores here is, how can you find hope in a ruthlessly hopeless world? As I alluded to before, there is extreme violence in this trilogy against children, against those who are defenseless, and Weeks treats all of this with a pitiless lens. He doesn't let you look away from the sheer evil that the most corrupt people are able to bring out on their world. And it's sobering, and at times, it's very hard stuff to read. And it's easy to look at Brent Weeks' weaker qualities and say that he doesn't handle this well. And I think there are times where it's true, where maybe he could handle something better. But especially if you pay attention closely to what he's doing, if you listen to things that he said outside of the books as well, it seems like he's very mature in how he goes about doing this. Your mileage may vary there, but the reason why I call the trilogy anti-grimdark is because of this, that even though there are ruthlessly dark, hopeless circumstances that all our characters are forced to trudge through, many of the main characters refuse to give up looking for hope. Now, some prominent examples do, but he has this question of how do you find hope in this hopeless world? People need to find grounding. They need to find something outside of themselves to be able to carry on, to keep pushing through this very dark world. And as the reader, you're able to see if they're able to find grounding and security in some of these things, in the horrific circumstances that these characters live in, then maybe I'm able to find the strength to keep pushing through as well. So often this looks like characters sacrificing things that are beneficial to them for the greater good of others. This happens very prominently very early in Book 1, The Way of Shadows, when Azoth's best friend, Jarl, gives up all the money that he's saved up to be able to send Azoth off to be apprenticed to the assassin. And for Jarl, this has huge implications. He's spent years hoarding up this money so that he would be able to get out, and yet he's willing to sacrifice that, be self-sacrificial, and give that to his friend for him to escape. And Jarl becomes one of the first truly moral characters in the series, even though he's a male prostitute. One of the other people that we see this in is one of his primary mentors, Kylar's primary mentors, which is Count Drake. And Count Drake is a man of faith. And a lot of questions of faith are explored in this series, and Brent Weeks kind of tips his hand that that's going to be the case, because about a third of the way through Book 1, Count Drake quotes St. Francis of Assisi. And there's a few other allusions to quotes from the Bible throughout the series. Now, Brent Weeks isn't preaching by any means, but Drake especially is a very religious character, and we see that faith being a strong source of hope for him, and yet having to wrestle through his belief in a God, his belief in a loving God, and seeing horrible things that happen to him and even to his family. It's an excellent examination of what it looks like to wrestle with faith under extremely painful circumstances. Throughout the series, there is a tenacious refusal to give up hope. And this becomes especially apparent in the second book, where Kylar, and I'll leave it vague and just say his lady love, their relationship begins to develop more. And Kylar finds hope to push through and to carry on through the difficulties and suffering of life by having that grounding in that relationship, in that desire to start anew and to raise a family and to leave his old life of being an assassin, being a wet boy, leaving that behind. And then the third point that I'd like to talk about, as far as some of the philosophical points in this trilogy, is can people find redemption for evil things that they've done? These fantasy characters are not squeaky clean. Our main characters are assassins, thieves, prostitutes, formerly corrupt officials, pompous nobles, etc. Brent Weeks is not afraid to show the world for how dark it is, and yet he makes the very distinct point, and I think this is a point that many grimdark authors make the opposite point of, which is that people can truly change. Brent Weeks very strongly believes in redemption. There are some characters that you could not see yourself rooting for or believing in at the beginning of the series that at the end become fan favorites. And the opposite is true as well. Characters who fall from grace over the course of the trilogy. One of the most powerful examples of a character finding redemption, and I'll leave it pretty vague, but is the aforementioned religious man, Count Drake. We learn more things about his backstory and learn that he has some really terrible skeletons in his closet. And the ways that he's able to move beyond that and find redemption and find hope, I found to be powerful. We also see this theme with the main character alluded to at the beginning, Logan Geyer. In his descent into hell over the course of the trilogy, he's forced to do things and participate in things that, isolated, if I were just to tell you what the things are, you would say those are the actions of a villain. And yet, he has to move on. He has to move past those things and be able to find a sense of forgiveness and make sense of those horrible things that he's had to do, and some even borderline evil things, in order to come out stronger and be somebody who's willing to stand up for the right thing. And obviously the strongest example of this in the whole trilogy is Kylar. And he sees this especially strongly with the aforementioned Lady Love character, once again, leaving it vague so as not to spoil a bunch of that plot. But really, that whole subplot of the story, I think, is one of the more powerful elements of it. That there are people around Kylar who believe in his chance of redemption so strongly that not just one or two, but multiple people are willing to lay down their life to try to make him a better man, to try to help see the potential within him, to turn his life around, to repent from some of the evil things that he's done. Because although Kylar is an assassin, he has a strong moral conscience. He has a strong moral center. He understands that there is such a thing as right and wrong. And he's also very aware of the sacrifice that other people are making for him. And for Kylar, he becomes an assassin, not just because it's his best option, which it is at the time when he is an orphan boy and he is living on the street, but also because he has an inherent draw towards that lifestyle. He feels the pull and the allure to be able to take some power over his previously powerless life. And he becomes very good at what he does. There's a draw to that. And him wrestling with, this is a core part of who I am, and at the same time I want to be somebody who fights for what's right and not just fights for myself, is a strong push and pull that becomes an arc through the whole trilogy. So guys, those are just a few thoughts about the Night Angel trilogy. This is a flawed trilogy. It's not perfect by any means. If you check my Goodreads, I actually didn't give any of these books 5 stars. They're all 4 stars for me because I had fundamental problems, at least in one significant way or another, with each volume. But when I heard a lot of the discourse about it, many people are either negative on it or very mixed about it. And as I said before, most of the criticisms, valid though they may be, seem to me to be very surface level. And I wanted to look at some of the themes that Brent Weeks plays with that I found to be really engaging and what pulled me in and what really made me want to keep turning the page or listening to it. Like I said, I highly recommend Simon Vance's reading of it. It really helped sell me on some of the cornier lines or weaker prose. This isn't a trilogy for everybody, but if you've been hesitant about reading the Night Angel trilogy so far, and some of the themes that we've discussed here today interest you, then I would recommend you give it a try. It's not perfect, there are flaws, and I'm fascinated to see what Brent Weeks is going to do with the new trilogy that he's writing, the Kylar Chronicles. That really is part of why I wanted to read this trilogy, is to see what he's going to do with the future books as well. But Weeks is an author that fascinates me. I think he could possibly be a favorite author. I can't wait to read his Lightbringer series. And even though these books are flaws, even though these books have flaws, I thought them very interesting, engaging reads, and worthwhile. If you're willing to look beyond some of the surface flaws, I think there's some really good pieces of gold here that you can find. So anyway, that's it for me, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. If there's other series that you're interested in hearing me talk about, just some of the themes or basic philosophical ideas that I found interesting in them, you can feel free to let me know. If you've read the Night Angel trilogy, let me know if you disagree with any of this. Like I said, I do think that it is fundamentally an anti-grimdark series. But that's it from me today, guys. Have a good day, and Godspeed.